Welcome, everybody, to the Unraveler Show with my special guest tonight, or this afternoon, I guess, Jacob Berman from History Valley. What's up, Jacob? How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, Alan. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, man, absolutely. It's been a while, and I'm so glad that we had this opportunity again, dude. I'm loving the scruff, man. What's going on with that? You doing a new look?
Oh no, it's just sometimes it happens, and then I get rid of it.
Oh,
Here,
see.
yeah.
Well, it looks good, man. It looks good. It's good
Well,
to have you here.
thanks.
Well, today we're talking about Paul's letters being forgeries. We're on a hunt for the real
hmm
Paul. It's a very cool title, and it's interesting. So, Jacob, I had somebody on one of the shares that I did about this episode today, and they said, "What difference does it make if Paul's letters are forgeries?" As if who cares, And this is a Christian asking. I'm like, what difference does it make? Like, this is huge. I mean, if they're forgeries, then he's not the apostle writing it, and therefore, if it's not an apostle, then it's not actual scripture, and it just kind of invalidates pretty much anything in the New Testament. But so that's just my first thought. I'm just like, what kind of question is that? But let's before we even get into this, why does this show matter? Why does this information matter?
Well, it matters if you want to know anything about a historical Paul, and so if you take the letters out of the equation, then what you know about Paul really comes down to First Clement of Rome. To say First Clement, written by Clement of Rome. The reason why I put it that way is that First Clement is our earliest extra biblical evidence for anything pertaining to Paul, the historical Paul, a writing attributed to him of any kind. And Clement says very little about Paul. Now, this doesn't impact Jesus, not as much, because Paul doesn't really say, the letters of Paul doesn't really say much about Jesus anyway. So it doesn't really impact that aspect of it. But the Gospels do come after Paul's letters. So it would, by putting the letters of Paul later, the Gospels would necessarily be even later than they already are. So that's one thing.
So sorry, so let me just ask, so that would that automatically follow? Like, because I think like the typical belief there is that the Gospels follow Paul's letters because of where they place Paul. But if in fact Paul's letters are forgeries, does that move the timeline of the Gospels?
Yes, because the Gospels. So, I date the Pauline letters from 94 and 97 CE, but I'll explain why.
Okay.
In the Gospels, I put them in the 2nd century, all 4 of them. But to go back to First Clement, First Clement is typically held by the standard view to have been written around 96, which I basically agree with, but I put the letters. So I put that one letter like 3 years earlier, like 93, because when you look at the beginning, around the beginning of First Clement, is talking about a persecution, another persecution that's befallen them, that's begun. It seems to have begun recently, like very, very recently, and under during the time of Emperor Domitian, the Roman Emperor Domitian, who was also the last Flavian emperor. Um, he reigned from like the early 80s, late 90s, like I think it's like 81, 96 CE. He gets assassinated in 96 CE. If I remember correctly, he became emperor in 81. We're told by the Roman historians that he wanted to return to the older ways, the traditions, the older traditions of the empire. And I think that happened because Emperor Vespasian, Titus Flavius Vespasianus Senior, wanted to be viewed as the Jewish Messiah. And this was through Josephus. Josephus says that Vespasian was the one who the prophets, who the oracles had predicted. That's what Josephus says in his Wars. Now, when you get to Domitian, he wants to get rid of all that. He wants to return to traditional Roman ways. Now, if you look at who is behind Clement of Rome, because like, who is that? The Clement of Rome was apparently a bishop. He was a bishop of the Roman episcopacy, the Roman bishopric. That's what we're told. But if you read First Clement, then First Clement is a long, long letter. Does he ever call himself a bishop? Just ask yourself that question. Does he actually ever call himself a bishop? It's kind of an odd thing. He never does. So then you have to ask yourself the question, what was Clement then if he wasn't a bishop? Because one can say from that the evidence it insinuates that he was turned into a bishop later. Now, when you look at the epistle to the Philippians, you see that it mentions Clement and Epaphroditus. And it also mentions Caesar's household. That combination of stuff is very important because in the 90s CE, Epaphroditus was executed by Emperor Domitian during his persecution, his second major persecution of philosophers. And then after that, he had Titus Flavius Clemens executed. Now, he came up with answers that were basically excuses. For instance, he had Epaphroditus killed because he was involved in helping Emperor Nero commit suicide. But that was like 30 years ago at that time. That doesn't make any sense. Why does that suddenly matter? And what was the excuse for killing Clemens? As Dio Cassius, the Roman historian, puts it, he succumbed to Jewish ways. Well, I want you to think about that for a second. He succumbed to Jewish ways. That's why Clemens was killed. And Clemens was a relative. He just killed a family member because he succumbed to Jewish ways. What does that even mean? So then this creates a quandary. This conundrum is, are we to believe that there was a Clement of Rome who was executed by the Romans under Emperor Trajan shortly after another Clemens? You got this Clemens who was killed under Domitian just a few years earlier under similar charges, or it's really the same story. Our earliest evidence for even having a different year of death for Clement of Rome at all is from Eusebius from the 4th century. He's the one that gives us this apparent contradiction, this different year of death for Clement of Rome. In Clement's information in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history is duplicated, literally. So the same kind of stuff that's used to describe Clement is used to describe Clement, but then Eusebius makes them out to be relatives. It's like, wait a minute. It's like he's running away from saying it's the same person, but then still leaves a connection there with them being relatives. Well, that's kind of odd. I don't exactly remember how he puts it that way, but the issue is, are we to believe, even if they relatives or not, are we really to believe that there are two separate Clements like that within like a decade of each other, less than a decade of each other, or they're the same person? Now, what is the implication of that? Why am I going there? Well,
can you
Clemens,
before you explain that, would Clement be considered a common name, or was that a rare name?
it wasn't a super common name.
Okay.
So
that would
but that's not the point. Dio Cassius has Clemens succumbing to Jewish ways. That's the major connection. That's what establishes the major connection between him and Clement of Rome. Now, if Dio Cassius hadn't said this, then the argument would be weak. But he does, fortunately. He does tell us this. So that changes the game. But then you also have to deal with the combination of Epaphroditus and Clement, both mentioned in Philippians. And then you have Caesar's household, also mentioned in Philippians. And Epaphroditus and Clemens were certainly connected to Caesar's household. Clemens was a Flavian. Epaphroditus helped Nero die. At least that was a charge laid upon him when he was executed. Well, I'll circle back around to that because that has to do with the Domitian persecution, and then it's going to have to do with the parousia in 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st Corinthians. I'll come back to that.
All right, sorry for taking you off track. I just was curious.
No, it's fine. Clement. So when you look at 1st Clement, let's look at the ignorance. Let's look at what's missing there. If these letters were written decades earlier, well, we have a problem because he only knows a letter. He uses the word epistolon or epistolon. So epistolon is a letter. So you have epistolon, a letter. But in 2 Peter, it has epistoles, which is plural, letters. Why does that matter? Well, 2 Peter uses the plural form because he wants you to know, hey, I know the entire collection of the Pauline corpus. But Clement just says a letter because he is not telling you that he knows an entire Pauline corpus. At the very least, he's not being clear. Does it absolutely prove that he only knew one letter? I suppose not, but it's not a good start. It gets worse from there. Clement says that Paul died a while ago, and he says, let's not dwell upon ancient examples. And then right after he says that, he says, let's look into heroes from our generation. So the way he puts it's kind of odd. And yeah, then he mentions Paul's death, but never says he met him. Why is that important? Because if you read Philippians, Paul and Clement knew each other. Even in the 3rd century, Origin of Alexandria, church father, even he says it's the same Clement. I'm not saying he said Titus Fabius Clemens was Clement. He doesn't say that. He said Clement of Rome was the same Clement mentioned in Philippians. So even if one rejected that Clement was Clemens, we still have a problem. We have a major church father in the early church acknowledging it's at the very least that the Clement mentioned in the letter to the Philippians is Clement of Rome. So did Clement forget that he knew Paul? That's a problem. See, that's if you admit it's the same Clement, then you have to ask yourself, how did he forget that he knew Paul, that he ever met him? Because he didn't. He doesn't meet him. There's another piece of evidence that rules out that the name thing is just some coincidence. In 1 Corinthians, Fortunatus, he's only mentioned in 1 Corinthians in the New Testament. In the Pauline corpus at least. I don't think he's mentioned elsewhere, but he's definitely in 1 Corinthians. Fortunatus is mentioned in the second to last verse in 1 Clement. Fortunatus is still alive, by the way, in the 90s in this text. But guess what Clement doesn't tell you? While he refers to Fortunatus as a messenger, he never says that he met Paul. Yet in 1 Corinthians, they're personally familiar with one another. And by the way, 1 Clement is written to the Corinthians. You see my point? So 1 Clement is written to the Corinthians, just like 1 Corinthians is written to the Corinthians. They both mention Fortunatus. In one letter, he knows Paul personally. And the other one, they don't. Which is it? So, again, it's another piece of evidence that says, okay, the 1 Clement is starting to contradict the New Testament now in more than one instance. It's contradicting the Pauline epistles. And then, when he talks about Paul, he never mentions Paul's vision. Yet he mentioned Paul talking about different parties in the church. Division between Apollos and Cephas. Or upper parties led by Apollos and Cephas, I'll put it that way. There's a parallel to that in 1 Corinthians 3. Which is what leads scholars to believe that 1 Clement knew 1 Corinthians. But Clement never mentions the co-author, Sosthenes. Sosthenes is the co-author of 1 Corinthians. Some of you have seen previous episodes probably heard me mispronounce his name as Sophanes. It's Sosthenes. But anyway, Sosthenes co-wrote 1 Corinthians. Clement knows nothing, never mentions him in his letter, ever. Never mentions any of the other co-authors. And I'll come back to talk about those co-authors. They play a major role in this discussion. What else Clement doesn't mention? He never mentions Paul's vision anywhere. Why is that important? Paul's vision was a major thing in 1 Corinthians. If he knew 1 Corinthians, if that's the letter he was quoting that parallel material from, how could he leave out Paul's vision? He never brings it up. And it gets worse than that. 1 Clement goes through Ezekiel, Isaiah, Proverbs, and other Old Testament books to discuss the coming of the kingdom of God. But you know what he never talks about? The parousia, the second coming of Jesus. The New Testament parousia is never talked about by Clement. Clement wants the church to have hope that God's kingdom is coming. How could he leave out that Jesus would return? How does he not know about that? 1 Corinthians talks about the parousia. So does 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians especially. How could he not discuss this matter? Well, I say he didn't talk about it because it hadn't been created yet. And I'll talk about why I think, when I think that it was created, why I think it was shortly after Clement wrote his letter.
That connection right there makes a ton of sense, though, because that is such a central theme in the Bible and the New Testament. So, yeah, what an oddity to not mention, for sure.
Absolutely. The closest thing you get, if that's being generous, it's being kind, to a second coming of Jesus in 1 Clement, was when he says that Jesus, he uses Jesus as an example, as an exemplar. When he says that Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection, but that doesn't get you to a second coming. That's just to say Jesus is proof of a future resurrection. That doesn't mean he's going to come back and initiate it himself.
Right.
He never says that anywhere in that letter. So then, what can we know about a historical Paul? So I feel like I should discuss that first. It's not going to take too long before I get to discussing who I think wrote the letters under Paul's name and worked with the co-authors in the 90s. So if you strip the epistles if you take them out of the equation and you just get rid of them, what do we have left? Well, you have First Clement and the other so-called pseudo-Clementine literature. That's what you have left. And that's not a lot to work with, because that may seem like a lot of material, but there's not much Paul in there. I can tell you that right now. In fact, we get more material about Paul, I would say, from First Clement than the pseudo-Clementine literature. So, well, I'll start with First Clement. In First Clement, you have Paul. He calls him an apostle. He notices he does not talk about his vision. He talks about Apollos and Cephas as leaders of different parties. He goes furthest west in the empire after having suffered 7 times in bondage, apparently. Now, that's an interesting detail. Paul suffered 7 times in bondage. That's basically 7 imprisonments. Are there 7 imprisonments of Paul in the New Testament? No. Even if you try to make Acts work with the epistles, you don't get 7 imprisonments. 7 imprisonments. Now, what about those shipwrecks? The 2 Corinthians talks about 3 shipwrecks. Acts talks about 1. Where are they? Where's those shipwrecks? Clement doesn't know anything about them. I would say that Paul never went through those shipwrecks. Those are embellishments. So he goes furthest west of the empire.
If it was real, he also has very bad luck.
Yeah.
Goes through 3 shipwrecks in one lifetime.
Exactly. So he goes furthest west of the empire. That's Hispania. That's furthest west of the empire. And then he's killed. Not by Romans, but by envious men. In my forthcoming paper that I just recently finished editing, and it's been a final draft that's on its way out to being published in the Journal of Higher Criticism.
Congratulations, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Very exciting.
I point out that there's 2 Christian scholars. 2 Christian scholars. I just want to make that point really clear here. That say that other Christians killed Paul. You know why they say that? Because of First Clement. Oscar Coleman and David Eastman. Well, that's their names. They argue that other fellow Christians killed Paul the Apostle, not the Romans. And I see why they think that, because in First Clement, it kind of sounds like that. What I think happened was they weren't Christians as we know them. This was something different. This was like Nazarene. This was pre-Christian, like before that movement was totally replaced by Christians. As Acts talk about. That's like the only thing I believe that Acts gets right, and I think everything else in Acts is literally wrong. One of the reasons I think is like the church fathers have other documents that seem to indicate that they were originally referred to as Nazarenes. And then you have the connection between Nazarene and Netzir, branches, the word for branches in Hebrew. So this has to do with the Old Testament stuff. So so there seems to be good reason to accept that detail, and that's it. Acts is pretty much fiction from everywhere else. Now, that aside, Acts aside, that is. What did Paul do to deserve to be killed, to be assassinated in Hispania? What happened? Why did they hunt him down and kill him? He must have done something to really piss him off. What was it? It doesn't mean he did something to actually deserve death. Or did he? Well, again, we're trying to put ourselves in the minds of these Nazarenes that had Paul killed. But I'll get to when I think Paul was killed. When he was killed is largely a guess. Now, we go to the Clementine recognitions, which was written around 150. It's written a couple of decades, it's less than a couple of decades after the Gospel of John, I would say. Because I think John's written around like 135. So I'm that recognition is like circa 150. So if it was written exactly in 150, that would be like 15 years later. And the recognitions in Book 1, Chapter 70 mentions that Saul attempted to assassinate James, the brother of Jesus. When you go on to chapter 71, 72, we learn that Caiaphas, the high priest, ordered Saul to try to kill James. So the original Paul, the real Paul, who never converted to Christianity, never believed in Jesus, never actually believed in Jesus. He never converted, never had a vision, never claimed to have ever had a vision. He was an assassin working for the high priest Caiaphas. Now, we have a problem. There's a problem with this, and that is there are some scholars that take the recognitions very seriously. But what was the source behind that detail about Saul attacking James? That's tricky. I have a theory behind that. We're told in chapter 71, 72, one of those chapters, that Zacchaeus, and this is in book 1 of recognition, so just repeat that. We're told that Zacchaeus wrote concerning James. What happened to him? He's concerned that Caiaphas is going to try again. Yes, they're still concerned Caiaphas wants James dead. That's very clear when you read those chapters in book 1. So that tells me that the recognitions used the letters of Zacchaeus that are totally lost. We don't have the letter or letters of that written by that man. They're gone. But the recognitions is preserving that material to incorporate it into a larger historical fiction. Because the recognitions is mostly historical fiction. Mostly. When you go to book 1, you get a lot of serious stuff there, or at least what I would say is serious stuff. So when did the attack happen? When did Saul attempt to assassinate James? Oh, one more thing. There's another detail. So the actual text does not name Saul, but we're told in a different manuscript in a margin note that Saul's name was originally mentioned. That means his name was removed. Now, why was that name removed? Well, for obvious reasons. We can't have Paul trying to kill James' brother. I pretty much know who removed it. It's so obvious. We get our recognitions around 401 CE from Tyrannus Rufinus. That's his name. He admits to modifying the text. So that man is responsible for how we have the text, how we currently receive the text today. Literally, how do we know this? He added a preface to it, and he mentioned it. He just does. It's not even a theory. He just outright tells you. He took things out, put things in, etc. He's telling you this. That he messed with it. So yeah, the recognitions as we have it in its final glory, fullest glory, I guess you put it that way, is early 5th century. But Origen in the 3rd century in his Philokalia, Origen of Alexandria's Philokalia, mentions the Travels of Clement, book 10. Now, book 10 means there's another 9 books before it. So that means he knew 10 volumes. So that means nearly the whole text was written hundreds of years earlier. But in the 5th century, Tyrannus Rufinus did, I think, some minor modifications. I don't think he did anything major. I think he did some minor tweaking of the text, such as removing Saul's name, so that way he doesn't get blamed for trying to kill James, the brother of Jesus. All right. Let's go back to reconstructing the chronology. When did the attack happen? Well, if you go a few chapters before, several chapters before, we learn about the recognitions, or again, it's really Zacchaeus being quoted in recognitions in book 1 when it comes to this material. And that is the material that I'm talking about. I'm pretty sure goes back to Zacchaeus. James and John.
Just a second. Just to let everybody know, if you are watching and you have questions for Jacob, go ahead and throw them in the chat as we are going through. If it is a super chat, we'll take it right away as Jacob's talking, because I'm going to assume that'll relate to something he's dealing with right now and right then and there. But I'm not going to stop for every single question. But if it is a super chat, I will absolutely stop. They will take priority and make sure that Jacob can answer you so that we can make sure everybody's tracking. And otherwise, if I miss anything, other questions besides super chats, I will take them all at the end. But go ahead and start formulating those. And I just wanted to let you know that we'll be taking them. So sorry, Jacob. Go ahead, keep going.
No problem. And I do see a couple of super chats, but we'll get to them in a moment.
Yeah.
Now
I should probably do them right now then, since I just made that comment.
Sure.
I fish in a tie, $2.
Thank you for your super chat.
Thank you very much for the super chat. Are the creeds and hymns in Paul early and authentic?
I only think that the stuff in 1 Corinthians 15 about Cephas, the 500, and James having visions of Jesus, I think the original Paul wrote that, and that has to do with the word gegrapti. Gegrapti means according to the scriptures. That's so 1 Corinthians 15 is already telling you that material is being quoted from an earlier text that's lost. That's what that means. Clement uses he says according to the scriptures a lot when he quotes the Old Testament. So we have numerous examples of that word being used to refer to other material. Now, so I know this has to go back to an earlier text. Now, we're told by the church fathers that there's a text called the Secrets of Elijah. Origin of Alexandria talks about this. And there's another one that talks about this. I'm forgetting the name. It's slipping my mind. It might be Epiphanius. I can't remember for sure. The Secrets of Elijah is supposedly quoted by 1 Corinthians and Ephesians. And then Ephesians has to do with what your eye has not seen, nor your ear has heard. And if I remember correctly, Epiphanius is the other church father that talks about this. He's the one that claims that Ephesians is quoting it. I get into this in my paper. It's a little bit that citation is a little bit problematic because it's not as clear. And again, I might be misremembering the name of the church father, but the church father that I'm talking about is not so clear if it's really the same text that Origen is talking about. Origen, on the other hand, is claiming that 1 Corinthians is quoting it, and I think it's 1 Corinthians 2:9, if I remember correctly. And so I'm seeing that it's insinuated that this text goes back to Paul, but they're not telling you that it's by Paul. 1 Corinthians is surely not going to tell you it's by Paul. You know why it's not going to tell you it's by Paul? Because if you admit that 1 Corinthians is quoting Paul as scripture, it may give a wink to the reader that everything else around it's a forgery. All of 1 Corinthians is a forgery, but that little bit, that tiny bit. And then Clement talks about Paul's gospel. What is that? Paul's gospel. It's a separate text from the letter. What is that? He's not clear. But the other clue that this goes back to Paul is when canonical Paul, I haven't gotten to who that is yet, he inserts himself in 1 Corinthians 15. And the word he uses, ektromati, which is connected to the Greek word ektroma, out of time. He says, I'm born out of time. It uses ectromaty to put in the out of time thing. And then he says, then he had the vision conveniently after that. I'm like, wait a minute. This sounds like he's inserting himself into the situation. This person posing as Paul is claiming to have had a vision just after James got it. Just after James received it. Hardly makes sense. It's just, and the fact that Clement doesn't know anything about Paul's vision all but confirms that bit wasn't there in this creedal statement.
I'm assuming you're wrapping yourself back around to where you left off. So let me just pop this one up. Goran Merrick 95514. Keep doing the good work for $2. Thank you very much, Goran Merrick. We appreciate that. And gonna keep on letting Jacob keep going then.
Yeah. So the Clementine recognitions in book 1. So it's really quoting from Zacchaeus here, and as the attack on John and James, these sons of Zebedee. So in Acts of the Apostles, we're told this story that's totally fiction, that James was killed by the command of Herod Agrippa I, King Herod Agrippa I. So wait. Hold on. So James dies, then John the Apostle outlives him for several decades. That's what we're told. But according to Zacchaeus, writing in the late 30s, like writing in 36, really, because he's writing immediately after the attack happened again on James Brother Jesus. I'll talk about why I put it in 36 in a moment. Because James and John, son of Zebedee, were there at Mount Gerizim. That's what the text says. He was at Mount Gerizim during the Mount Gerizim incident that got Pilate removed from power. The Samaritan massacre that Josephus is talking about. We're being told details that Josephus does not talk about. James and John were there to try to stop the Samaritans from doing what they were going to do. Then they became quiet. Then they stopped. That's how the text goes. And I think it's implying that they were killed, and I think by the Samaritans. What I think confirms that assessment is that Papias of Hierapolis, in the 2nd century, we're told by a church father that the Jews, as he puts it, killed James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And the Samaritans, of course, were a group of Jews. So James and John died together in 36. John the Apostle did not live for many decades and become John the Elder. These are two different Johns. But I think the reason Luke wanted John to outlive James was so he could become John the Elder, John the Presbyter. But there's no reason to think it's the same John at all. And by the way, this would give rise to some of the later ecclesiastical claims that John became the author of John's Gospel in the 90s and the whole beloved disciple stuff. So Acts is very important for that, if you get what I'm trying to say, to make John outlive James so he can be involved in gospel writing. So there's a major agenda behind Luke. Now, I don't think Luke knew John. I can see somebody misunderstanding what I'm saying. I'm not claiming Luke knew John. I think John knew Luke and the other Gospels. But I think Luke's agenda is to make John become John the Apostle become John the Elder in the late 1st century. But he doesn't. That's not what happened. Anyway, the Samaritan incident happened in 36. The Samaritans are massacred. Pilate ordered the Roman troops there because he ordered troops there because he wanted to prevent the rise of a new movement by a man who claimed to have been Moses returned. And he had them massacred. And James and John were killed right before the massacre happened by the Samaritans. Why is that important? Because the attack upon James happened after that. It happened in 36. It happened while Caiaphas was still in power as high priest. And Caiaphas was not high priest long after that happened. he was removed from power, according to Josephus. But why was he removed from power? Josephus doesn't say. Is it because he's associated with Pilate, because of the Samaritan massacre? Josephus doesn't say. Well, Zacchaeus, who's quoted in Recognitions, book 1, he gives you the reason. He ordered Saul to try to kill James, the brother of Jesus. You're muted.
I apologize. Thank you, Jacob. Let's pause and take a question. From Backend Pan Danibus for $10. Wouldn't it be likely that Clementine Recognitions uses Acts as its basis for placing events like the stoning of Stephen in the 30s, using Zacchaeus as an alternative authority, just like pseudo Paul?
No. Thank you for the super chat. No. That would be to suggest that Stephen was replaced with James's death instead of the reverse. That makes absolutely no sense. Why would somebody do that? Why would somebody blame James, the brother of Jesus, blame Saul for trying to kill James, the brother of Jesus? Luke in Acts is replacing James with Stephen, just to literally avoid blaming Paul, for trying to kill James, the brother of Jesus. It's to rescue him. And I didn't even get into my second source, quoted by Dorothea Satire. So Dorothea Satire, or I should really say so-called pseudo-Dorothea Satire, 3rd century CE. I think he lived in like late 3rd, early 4th, something like that. I'll just say 3rd century CE for simplicity. But it's probably more like 3rd, 4th. But Saul was involved in trying to kill James, according to Abdias of Babylon. This is another source. It's written a little later than Zacchaeus. But not by much. Abdias of Babylon, and I put him in like 37. It could even be late 36, just a little after Zacchaeus. Doesn't really matter. This point stands, and that is Abdias of Babylon actually finishes the story. He refers to James as James, son of Alphaeus, which the Recognitions also does, by the way. They have an agreement on that, and that's important because that means Zacchaeus and Abdias agreed on certain details regarding James. That's all. That's really what that means. James was nearly killed by Saul, and then an unnamed man armed with a fuller's club brained him. We don't know who that is, but another man armed with a fuller's club brained James, the brother of Jesus.
Let's pause for just a second. From I Fish in the Tie again for $2.
Thank you for the super chat.
Thanks for the super chat. Yep. Was Paul insignificant until 2nd century and Marcion?
I would say Paul wasn't significant until Clement of Rome.
Okay. Back to you.
All right, so James was almost killed by Paul, but another man had to finish the job. And there are scholars out there that also recognize that Luke is replacing the story of the attack upon James with Stephen, like Robert Eisenman. I think also Jeffrey Butts and others mention this. I'm not alone in this by far. There are other scholars out there that see the overlap. They see the connection. But let me just say, I find it impossible. Not even possible. I don't say this slightly. I find it impossible that Stephen's story was original. I think it's absurd that Stephen's story was the original one. Totally absurd. Stephen's mentioned in 1 Corinthians, by the way. That's right. Greetings to the household of Stephanos. I'll come back to that in a second because I'm skipping a lot there. Let's go back to reconstructing Paul back in the 30s. So, what became of Paul after this happened? Well, let's talk about what became of the people in power first. Pontius Pilate, who was prefect of Judea at the time, was summoned by Emperor Tiberius to appear before him because of the Samaritan massacre. Tiberius dies before Pilate gets there. Emperor Caligula, so Caligula becomes emperor, and then he finalizes Pilate's removal from power. So Pilate doesn't get any better luck there. He gets totally removed from power, and that's the end of him. That's the end of his significance here. And then you have Caiaphas getting removed from power as high priest. And then you have Paul going furthest west of the empire. But not just Paul. Former Tetrarch Herod Antipas also went to Hispania. Now, some will say, well, didn't he go to France? Like, there's a weird apparent contradiction. I don't think it's a contradiction. Like, oh, he was in France in antiquity, Spain. He was in Spain in wars. What matters for my purposes is he was in Spain in 39, Hispania in 39. That's what matters for what I'm talking about. He goes to Spain in 39, which leads me to the conclusion that Paul went to Spain because Herod Antipas went to Spain. The movements of Herod Antipas and Paul in First Clement are the same. They're both going to the first west of the empire. You see my point? So they're both heading to the same territory, the same part of the empire. Antipas dies in 39. And I think Paul was also killed in 39. I'm not sure. I tend to think different things. I sometimes wonder if Paul was killed because without Antipas, Paul had no protection. Paul was killed. I don't know if that's exactly right. Can't really know. But my best guess is Paul was probably killed in 39 by other Nazarenes who were pretty upset that he tried to kill James earlier. They hunted him down and killed him. They saw him as being complicit in murder because, well, he may not have killed James himself. Somebody else finished his task. But because he initiated the attack, James ended up dead. He caused the domino effect to happen that led to James's death in near immediacy, practical immediacy. And that's it. Paul's letter and that little gospel quoted in 1 Corinthians 15, those are just reports he wrote about the beliefs of the Nazarenes, not because he was actually a Christian. Just reporting what they believed. That's it. That's all he was trying to do. He was trying to report. That's all it was. So then, when do we get the letters? Jerome mentions a man called Saul from Giscala. Note this says from Giscala. That detail is important. That's to distinguish him from the earlier Paul. He's from Giscala. Gush in Hebrew. He's from Gush. He's quoting Epaphroditus, by the way, in a lost document that we don't have. Here's what this document says about that man, according to how Jerome describes him. And just to be clear, he says the information, he links it to Epaphroditus, so I take it that it's coming from him. But anyway. Saul and his family were from Giscala. Then they removed themselves after the Romans seized it. Now let's stop right there for a second. There's more than that. We'll get to that. When did this happen? When did the Romans seize Giscala? 67 CE during the First Roman-Jewish War. So that already tells me this is not Paul. This is somebody else living decades later. And by the way, he's called a young man in this text when he left with his family. Then his family goes to Tarsus after the war. The whole thing was over. And then he was taught by Gamaliel. No, well, hold on a minute. How is he taught by Gamaliel after the war? And we all know in Acts, written by Luke, that Gamaliel the first taught Paul. That can't be right. Well, look at the complete list of Sanhedrin rulers. There's another Gamaliel. Came into power around the year 80. Gamaliel II. That's who Epaphroditus was talking about. It was Gamaliel II that taught Saul. A much later person. Much later. 10 years out of the fall of the Second Temple. So now things are starting to make sense. So this guy was behind the letters. He was behind the letters of Paul. He worked with the co-authors. And the Acts of Timothy were told that Timothy, who co-wrote many of the Pauline letters, was killed in Ephesus in the year 97 CE when he interrupted the festival of Catagogia that had to do with the worship of Artemis on Ephesus. So Timothy's dying in the 90s. Epiphanius mentions that Corinthus caused a situation in Galatia to occur that resulted in the epistle to the Galatians being written as a response. When did Corinthus? When was Corinthus doing these things? Read Irenaeus. Irenaeus says that Corinthus and John had a conflict at a bathhouse in Ephesus in the 90s. 97, to be specific. So Corinthus is also in the 90s. Timothy's in the 90s. So we have numerous examples of these characters appearing in the 90s. Epaphroditus and Clemens, I've mentioned them several times in this show. Also 90s. Again. Fortunatus. Also 90s. So we have numerous examples of all these characters being alive in the 90s. So let's go to 1 Thessalonians. So 1 Thessalonians, which is the first Pauline letter, not in the New Testament, but it's the first of the letters to be written, talks about a persecution that's befallen them, just like Clement of Rome does. Talks about that Jesus is coming back soon. They will be raptured into the clouds. They were taken up into the clouds, which rapture is based upon. Then you have 2 Thessalonians, which elaborates and kind of contradicts 1 Thessalonians. The 2 Thessalonians talks about the son of lawlessness persecuting the church, claiming to be a deity. And the text says that Jesus will come back and assassinate him. Oh, and he was also having an image of himself, an idol of himself built, placed in the temple. Now, there was no temple for Domitian to put an image of himself in the 90s. Caligula did that, tried to do that in the 40s, but late 30s, early 40s, but that didn't work. Some try to claim that Caligula was the son of lawlessness, 2 Thessalonians, but the problem with that is that there are no records of Caligula persecuting Christians, and of any kind. The church fathers never talk about anyone being martyred by Caligula. That were anyone that were Christians, that is. We only have this with Domitian. Only with Domitian. But Domitian did build a can't remember fully, but something to do with I think it was a temple of Sol Invictus or an image. I can't remember fully, but it had to do with using that to represent worship of himself, if I remember correctly. So there is a parallel there to Domitian to a degree, but the point I want to focus on is that Domitian was assassinated in 96 CE by Stephanos. We're told that by Roman historians.
Jacob, is this a good place so I can take a pause and ask a question?
Sure.
All right, got a super chat from Steve M 1984 for $5. Thank you for the super chat. I guess the fundamental question for the theory is why take an assassin and invent a Christian prophet? Why use Paul in particular for this? Because
he was an empty vessel. They didn't have anybody else they could turn into to a person like this. But also, They're already struggling with this in Acts as it is, transforming Saul into becoming Paul. When you look at recognitions, which is using Zacchaeus, you look at Abdias of Babylon, you look at these texts and you see that Saul being also called Paul, he's not becoming Paul the same way he does in Acts. It's different. He's being called Saul as part of polemic, as part of a polemical strategy to compare him to King Saul from the Old Testament. Oh, Saul persecuted King David, just like he persecutes us. It's like Paul persecutes us. See, that's why they're calling him Saul. It's a comparison. He's persecuting us just like Saul persecuted David. That's the point I'm making.
Cool. All right, well, back to you then.
So, Second Thessalonians is talking about a plot to assassinate the son of lawlessness, but Jesus himself would be the one to carry it out. I think that the plan to kill the son of lawlessness was the plan to kill Domitian. Now, let me be clear about something. I'm not claiming that Domitian's second major persecution of the philosophers was directed primarily against Christians, but I think Christians were caught in the middle. They were caught in the middle. And the reason they were caught in the middle had to do with Titus Fabius Clemens. He succumbed to Jewish ways, according to Dio Cassius. And by the way, I just want to remind everybody about that detail. It's a thing that we need to keep in mind. Domitian wanted Clemens dead, and I think the reason he wanted him dead was because Clemens was a candidate to be emperor. He was a Flavian by blood. He had a claim to the throne to be emperor. Domitian couldn't have that.
Interesting.
He needed Clemens gone.
I have a question that I'm going to treat as a super chat, Jacob, because I can't accept them on my channel, but this person was willing to, and I appreciate their support. From Vesper8385, Jacob, what positive evidence dates the undisputed Pauline letters after 70 CE, rather than merely weakening the case for pre-70 dating, and what would falsify your post-70 model?
Well, I've seen this person comment over and over again on my videos, and including what I suspect could be AI-generated answers, AI-generated analysis of what I'm saying.
Okay.
But that's a long story I don't want to get into here. But I'm gonna point out some hypocrisy by this person. He likes to talk about strange stuff and gospels and stuff, the gospel ergoton, some crap like that, and other stuff, and says some things that I personally find to be strange views. And he often tries to attack my position, tries to make a mockery of it. I have other people that criticize my theory, but I appreciate completely and take seriously, and I've made improvements to it, but not like this. So I just wanted to throw out the hypocrisy real quick. I don't normally do this. I don't normally react like this. So you have to really get me thinking like that to you know what I mean, for me to react like that. But anyway, that's the kindest way I can put it, and that's literally maybe very generous. But here's what I'll say. When you look at 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, I say this in my paper. It talks about the wrath of God having come upon the Jews for what they had done to Jesus. When you read church fathers, they say that the death of James, like let's take Origen for instance. Origen quotes the James passage from Josephus, and he says that the death of James caused the war and which would mean it would result in the destruction of the temple. Well, that's a misquote of Josephus, but that's beside the point. Origen is connecting James's death to the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple is the wrath of God. And several church fathers talk about that. The destruction of the temple is the wrath of God. So how is it that other references are the wrath of God, but 1 Thessalonians is not? Oh, it's Emperor Claudius. That's the wrath of God. Expulsion of the Jews from Rome in 49. That's a wrath. That's not much of a wrath. That's a relocation. How is that a wrath? How is that a wrath? Honestly, that doesn't make any sense to me. It's frustrating. There's even some scholars that will say that some will concede that's a reference to destruction of the temple. But you know what they'll say? It's an interpolation. Right? Where's the manuscript evidence supporting this as interpolation? You know how long you have to wait for any kind of manuscript evidence, and it doesn't even remove it all. If I remember correctly, it's 1,000 years later. I talk about this in my paper. I cite the scholastic analysis. That's just one manuscript where it's missing either some or all of it. I don't remember if it was some or all of it. 1,000 years later in a Latin text. Is that the best you can do? Really? And by the way, that's late enough to be aware of Marcion. Why is that important? Because Marcion removed much of that stuff in his version of 1 Thessalonians. So it could be inspired from Marcion and his abridging of the text. It's that late. Because of that, it doesn't count. Doesn't work out. And I have things to say about Marcion, but I'd rather save that for toward the end. Just like I do in my paper. Marcion's at the end of my paper.
Well, thanks for getting off track for that. But let's get back to with him. Perfect.
I'll say one more thing about the question.
Okay.
All it would take to destroy me, make me like a fool, make my whole sphere look like it's a pile of nonsense. Find me a manuscript of this letter before 70, and I'm done. I'm done. Find me one of these canonical letters before 70, and it's over. That's it. That's all you gotta do. All right. So Domitian was persecuting the philosophers. He wanted to get rid of Clemens because Clemens was a claim to the throne. A claimant to the throne. And so he did. So let's talk about the order that these letters are written in. All right. I say 1 Thessalonians is first, then 2 Thessalonians is next. I have both letters being written in 94, by the way, both of them. When you look at 1 Corinthians, which I think it's the next letter, 1 Corinthians mentions that they have been defamed, but it doesn't say what it means by defamation. It just says we are being defamed right now. And I think that that so-called defamation was the prelude to their arrest and the imprisonment that we see in Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. What I'm going to do, because I want to get this especially right, I'm going to open the paper real quick to make sure that I get the order as I put it down in the paper correctly. Let's see here. So the order of the prison letters, I put them in. It has to do with the mention of Epaphras, which is also Epaphroditus, same guy. All right, here we are. I got it all right here. So I have the prison letters going Philemon, Philippians, and Colossians. I have Colossians being last of the prison letters. I don't have Ephesians. So at one point in the page, so I thought maybe Ephesians could be between Colossians and 2 Corinthians, but as I continue, I conclude that Ephesians was actually after 1 Timothy, but before 2 Timothy. And the reason I say that is because in Ephesians, you have this thing that's mentioned. I have been imprisoned. That's not imprisoned. Sorry. He says, I am suffering imprisonment because I am being. He's saying his preaching of Jesus was a torture. He's saying that he is preaching for the sake of the Gentiles. He's suffering imprisonment because of the Gentiles, because he preaches for them. Like, wait a minute, that's not something he says in Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. It sounds like it's a mental imprisonment. He's not being literal here. But in Philemon, Philippians, and Colossians, that's very different. He's very descriptive about his imprisonment, where he's not really being that way in Ephesians, Galatians, Titus, 1st, 2nd Timothy, by the way, those 5 letters are the single authored letters. There's no co-author involved in those letters. And all the other ones that Paul is attributed as author of, they are co-authored. Every single one. So all the other 8 letters are co-authored. So anyway, I put 1 Corinthians in 94 as well. And then I have Philemon, Philippians, and Colossians, and 2 Corinthians being written, I would say, in 96. And then I have Romans. I'm sorry, not Romans. Yes, Romans. Romans and Galatians. I have them being written in 97, along with Titus, 1st, 2nd Timothy. Romans, I suppose, could also be late 96 instead, because there he talks about how, in Romans, he talks about he's going to go and preach across the Roman Empire. He's going to cross through the empire, and he's going to go to Spain, Hispania. Kind of like the original Paul did, but partly to pretend to be that man. Kind of like he's writing a letter, like a prequel to the journey to Spain, which is absurd. He never, by the way, in the letters, he never says he made it to Spain. If anything, he doubles back, going the opposite direction. He says in Romans he's going to go back to Jerusalem a second time anyway, which is why I think Galatians is written afterwards. Bartosz Adamczewski, who does not agree with me, like he'll put Paul's letters in the 40s. But that aside, I agree with him on this, that Galatians is after Romans, because Romans seems to be saying that the second journey to Jerusalem is going to happen. Not has happened, it will happen. In Galatians, there were 2 journeys to Jerusalem. When you look at the prison letters, Paul, quote unquote, mentioned that I'm going to be released soon. Hey, wait a minute. In church tradition, he's supposed to get beheaded by Nero. We all know that. What do you mean you're about to be released soon? Then in 2 Timothy, he mentioned his imprisonment as a past event when he thanked Onesiphorus for visiting him in his chain. So let me put it this way to you. When is the only time in the entire 1st century that Christians were known to be imprisoned and released by a Roman emperor? 96, 97 CE is the only 2 years in the entire 1st century. In the entire 1st century where anything like this happened involving Christians of any kind. Domitian gets killed, then Emperor Nerva comes into power, removes those who were imprisoned by Domitian, which was all kinds of different people. Only time in the whole 1st century where this happened that fits what the letters says. Fits. You see my point? It's the only time in the whole 1st century where all this comes together. All right, so what about Galatians? Oh, Galatians is surely written before 70. I mean, James is alive, you know. That's what typical standard view. James is alive, and Jerusalem is still standing. That's what it says. It doesn't have to be still standing. I mean, they could have just met at the rubble, literally. They could have met afterwards at Jerusalem. After it was destroyed. They still could have done it. Doesn't preclude that in any way. You still have to explain why the church father Epiphanius thought that Galatians was written because of Corinthus. That Corinthus was a so-called heretic in 97. What's that about? Well, Corinthus was an Ebionite. I'll go as far as to say he's probably the founder of the Ebionites, a distinct group who disagreed with the Christians. The Ebionites and Christians are like two breakaways to the Nazarenes. The Ebionites rejected the divinity of Jesus. Corinthus said that the Christ wasn't Jesus. Okay? He said the Christ entered into Jesus' mind at the baptism and took over like a possession. You see my point? So he possesses him and takes control like an angelic or a demonic possession. And I just realized I need to talk about another thing here that I didn't really address in this show. But I'll circle back to putting Paul's letters in the 90s. What about the James and Josephus? We're supposed to believe that's the same person as James, the brother of Jesus. Josephus says so. James, the brother of the so-called Christ. Surely that must be the same man. Antiquities 29:1. That must be the same guy, right? So we're told. No. There's no reason to think this, in my view. Is there a reason to think? Well, let me start over. I understand the reasons for thinking it, but here is what my problem is. If you look at the first and second apocalypses of James, which are second century text, we are told, and again, just like with the recognitions, parts of it goes back to an earlier man. You look at the first apocalypse of James, it tells you that man's name was Addai. And it's interesting. He says it was Addai wrote 10 years after the Lord's wrath or after the destruction. He says something like that. I can't exactly remember fully. That would mean basically the year 80. So, when you look at the first apocalypse of James, it says that James was the spiritual brother of Jesus. It says that James was not the literal brother of Jesus by blood. He was only spiritually his brother, only called his brother. That's how the text starts. You go to the second apocalypse, names him as Feuda, names James's father as Feuda. Now, John Painter, he points out that this James in this text was killed in the same way that James and Josephus was, by the way. Stoning by the Jewish authorities. You probably know where that's going. Josephus was not a Christian. I think it's not hard to see what happened here. Josephus got mixed up. He got confused. In fact, I think it's much more plausible that Josephus himself made the mistake rather than a Christian interpolator of access to a large amount of text in his time that's merging multiple Jameses as the same person and also dealing with a bunch of other Jameses. The Christian interpolator would not have made this mistake, in my view. But Josephus, I can see him making this mistake, and I think he did. He thought that this James was the brother of Jesus. He was actually a spiritual brother. Although I think Josephus himself might have been aware that there might be a problem. He might have not been totally sure of what he says. That's why he put it this way, legomeno Christou. James, the brother of Jesus, called Christ. That's what legomeno Christou means. Called Christ. So, I think Josephus didn't care to get into the whole issue. You see my point? He didn't want to go into detail about, is he really his brother or not? He doesn't care enough to talk about that. He's just going to leave it the way he wrote it, and that's it. Brief, to the point, moving on to the next person he wants to talk about. He doesn't care so much about working out, is this guy really his brother or not? I don't care about that much. I'll just say brother is so-called Christ and be done with it. Or called Christ. I'll say call the Christ. That's how I address it. So James in 62 CE was killed by Hanan ben Hanan, also known as Ananus, son of Ananus, the high priest of Jerusalem, was not the same James who was killed in 36 CE by a Fuller's Club, who Saul tried to kill himself earlier, but failed, and somebody else with a Fuller's Club brained James and finished the job. So, back to Galatians. I think that James in Galatians is Corinthus. It's not James. It's Corinthus being renamed James. Because he's the one that was in charge. He was the one that was in charge.
That's cool. We got a super chat coming in, probably inspired by something you just said. Bacon or Bakken, I guess. Pan Danibus for $5. Thank you for the super chat. What do you make of the James Apocalypses having Gnosticism? Wouldn't they be inclined to make Jesus not tied to the flesh to promote cosmic union?
Seems to be too much effort for me to be comfortable with that. Again, these texts form, when you put these texts together, they form a picture. They form a picture that the James and Josephus was not the literal brother of Jesus. And it makes sense with the other text that says that Paul tried to kill James. So that's why this argument doesn't work against me, in my view. Second Apocalypse, James is talking about Feuda. Names, that's kind of a bold thing to say. Feuda was his father. Who is that? Is the author of these apocalypses just making that up? Why is it that they're consistent that he's stoned to death like the James and Josephus was? What's that about? Kind of odd choices, in my view, if it's being made up purely because of Gnosticism. Yes, they're Gnostic. I don't deny that. These are Gnostic texts. It doesn't change what I'm saying.
Makes sense. So we have a bunch of questions that have come through that are not super chats. I'm gathering them for the end. So if you guys want to keep throwing those questions in there, you can. As you can see, we're taking the super chats as they come in. But thank you so much for all of your questions. I'm looking forward to throwing them at Jacob later. But Jacob, back to you. Let's keep going.
So let's talk about how Saul of Giscala, the so-called Paul of the Letters, met his end. In 2 Timothy, he said that his life is pouring out of him. Spendomai, it's pouring out of me. His life's pouring out of me. I think he means he's aging fast. He's aging fast. He's had enough of it. He says, I fought the good fight. I'm done. He's done. Now, here's the other thing that indicates that these letters were written in the 90s. Hebrews, for instance, which was not written by any of the co-authors, and it was not written by Saul of Giscala either. It's written by somebody else. Hebrews says that Timothy was released recently. Hebrews was written in 96 right there. That puts it in 96 right there. Before 2 Corinthians, by the way. It needs to be before 2 Corinthians. You know, I realized I didn't mention this earlier. 2 Corinthians mentions that Paul suffered his imprisonments in the past. In the past. He was imprisoned in the past. The prison letters are put after 2 Corinthians, usually. But it's actually before. It's before them. Except Ephesians. Ephesians is after 1 Timothy. It's the second to last letter. So that's the evidence that the Philemon, Philippians, Colossians is before 2 Corinthians. Before that. So is Hebrews. I would say Hebrews was written probably between Colossians and 2 Corinthians. Now let's go back to what I was going to say a moment ago. So I can't remember where, but there was somewhere. It might have been in Titus or 1 Timothy. I can't remember where. Where Paul says something about I'm getting old now, something like that. And in Ephesians, he you can tell he's tired of it. Again, when I say Paul, I'm talking about Saul of Giscala, fake Paul, pseudo Paul. He's tired of it. He's tired of the work he's doing. And in Galatians, he was big mad. Big mad. He felt like his work was being undone in Galatia. Everything was collapsing. All his hard work for nothing. People buying into circumcision again. Ben and James coming to stop me. And Kephas runs away. Kephas runs away when they show up. Show him who's boss. So that's a problem. See, this is not. You know what Josephus said happened to people that were uncircumcised? Zealots would capture them and force them to be circumcised before 70. During the Jewish-Roman War, so 66-73 CE. So if Galatians was really written by Paul, I would believe he had the nerve to go to Jerusalem or Antioch or whatever, preach against circumcision. They probably would have killed him on the spot for saying this stuff. This doesn't make any sense to me at all. What about the fact that Paul was killed by Nero? Something the New Testament never mentions. Well, the late 2nd century, like around 170, 190, or I would say 160, 190, or 160, 200. I'll just say 160, 200. And that 40-year time span, we got the Acts of Paul. Somewhere in that 40-year time span, we get the Acts of Paul that comes out, which was written by Lucius Curranus. What did Lucius Curranus say? That Paul was killed by Nero, he was beheaded, and then his head got reattached to his neck in a resurrection. We don't seriously believe that. Come on. So, where did he get this from? Well, Josephus mentioned another Saul, Saulus, his brother Costaborus. Costaborus and Saulus appeared before Nero in 66 CE in Achaia, not Rome, to lay blame for the entire war upon Governor Florus. That's their goal. Very dangerous endeavor, mind you. And we never see those two again after they tried to do this. There's a super chat. I'll finish this after you take it.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the super chat.
M1984 for $5. If they're all post 70, could they be post Mark or written with Mark? Thinking about the Last Supper in particular.
There's a scholar named Nina Livesey, and she, I agree with a lot of what she says about Paul's letters in terms of letters being after 70, not genuine. But she says things that I don't agree with, like she puts Paul's letters after the Gospels and puts Paul's letters in the 2nd century. I don't agree with that. I absolutely do not believe Marcion priority. Completely reject Marcion priority. I do not think Marcion's text is first. And I do not believe that the Pauline epistles are after the Gospels. She thinks they're after the Gospels. I don't believe that. Well, she says they're after Acts, which in my view is effectively saying after the Gospels, or at least after the Synoptics. And I do not agree with that conclusion. So there. So anyway, so who do I think Cephas in Galatians was? Cephas, I don't think was the actual Cephas in the 30s. Just a different guy. I think it was the Bishop of Jerusalem, Simon Bart Cleophas. I think Simon got caught up in the midst of this whole thing. His authority was probably questioned because Corinthus is running around saying, we gotta keep circumcision down here, folks. We gotta keep it going. Yeah, I accept Jesus, but I don't accept he's Christ. I think the Christ was a celestial son of God who came down into Jesus during the baptism and took over his mind. So I think Corinthus, and by the way, just so we're clear, I think Corinthus made up John baptizing Jesus. I don't think that's historical. So I believe Jesus did exist. I think he did exist. Crucified. I put his crucifixion earlier in 26, the beginning of Pilate's reign, because that's when the testimonium, I think, places the crucifixion is in 26. But anyway, I don't think John baptized him. I think the baptism was created to kind of bring John Jesus movements even more closely together. I think they were already connected, but it's to make them even more connected than they actually were. And it's also to make John kind of subordinate to Jesus, not just kind of, it actually makes him subordinate to Jesus, makes him the success, makes Jesus his successor, when I think it was the other way around. I think John was after Jesus and James the brother. John was killed in 36 CE, by the way, at like not long after James himself was killed. See, 36 was a bad year. It was a horrible year for the movement, just losing one leader after another, very fast and quick succession. It was a horrible year for them. But anyway, I just realized I remember now. I didn't finish my point about Nero. I'll come back. So I'll circle back to this. I believe Lucius Carinus plagiarized the story of Saulus and Costobarus' appearance before Nero and pretended that was Paul. Conflated him with Paul, and that's how you get Paul's death under Nero. That's all he had to do, was pretend that Saulus and Josephus was Paul. And his appearance before Nero all of a sudden becomes Paul's death at the hands of Nero. In this fictional, legendary material called the Acts of Paul and Thecla, or Acts of Paul. It's just fiction. Created by plagiarizing Josephus and merging these characters into the same person. So you have Paul, the original Paul the Apostle, dying in 39, getting assassinated because he tried to assassinate James. He's complicit in murder. And then you got Saulus getting killed in 66 by the command of Nero. Then you have in 97 CE Saul of Giscala, the actual author of the letters, who co-wrote the letters with Timothy, Silas, Sosthenes, and Tertius, at least the majority of them, with not any one letter of all of them, but with one or two of them, depending on the letter. From 94 and 97 CE is when he wrote them, and I think he died of old age in 97. And I think what happened was, I think the Parousia was fabricated by Saul and his co-authors, his cohorts, to give hope to the church being caught up in the midst of the Domitianic persecution, in the middle of it. They retrofitted Paul the Apostle. They redeemed him by saying that he was once a persecutor. That's why the text puts it this way. He persecuted us, and now he believes. He had a vision. The vision rehabilitates him, you see. We're going to retroject our theological arguments and our suffering onto the historical Paul, and that's what they do. They remake Paul effectively in their image. They turn Paul into them. They twist him. They twist him, and they change him to suit their needs in the 90s. So the story of Paul trying to kill James is all of a sudden replaced with a theological argument that Paul never made. Paul goes from being a Torah Orthodox assassin working for the high priest Caiaphas to being a theologian, making arguments against circumcision in Galatians. Everything's changed. Paul's story of trying to kill James is largely forgotten, suppressed.
Man,
that takes me to Marcion. I'm sorry?
I said that flips everything on its head.
That takes me to Marcion. So I call the movement the New Pauline Chronology. That's what I say at the end of the paper. It's the New Pauline Chronology. And in this movement, it's not rejecting the historical Jesus. So I don't think I am not convinced that putting these letters after 70 means that there was no Jesus. To me, I'm still convinced there was a Jesus. I personally think the evidence is overwhelming that there was a dude that got crucified under Pilate. The letters are just later. You just have to change how you see the historical Paul. Now you look at Marcion. Marcion priorists have to throw First Clement into the second century. They have to throw First Clement to the wolves. And they do that because they think that Clement knew the New Testament. Well, he didn't. I showed multiple examples today that Clement does not know the New Testament. He doesn't know it. He doesn't know them. He doesn't even know about the second coming of Jesus. Doesn't even know about Paul's vision. He doesn't. We have another super chat, so I'll finish. in a moment.
All right. Where did that come through here? Back in Pandibius for $2.
Yeah, thank you for another super chat.
Couldn't core Paul was expand? Couldn't core Paul was expanded later like James? I'm not sure what he's trying to say. What he's trying to ask.
He's trying to say that this is a hypothetical document stuff that I just stay away from in my work because no, can't prove it. So, the Epistle of James was expanded. Prove it. What's the manuscript evidence for it? Doesn't exist. I already know the answer to it. Doesn't exist. Oh, core Paul was expanded later. Well, I guess I agree because Paul only wrote one letter that we're told about in one tiny gospel. That's it. What do you mean by core Paul? Usually when people say core Paul, because Marcion's text was expanded or something like that, or some hypothetical version of Paul's letters you can't prove ever existed. I'm like, no. We can make up anything we ever wanted with hypothetical documents unless we have external witnesses or manuscript evidence. I find myself having to repeat this all the time. It's quite tiring. And hypothetical text, I reject it unless we are told it existed at the very least by an ancient witness. There is no proof of this proto-Pauline corpus. Now, that takes me to Marcion stuff. Oh, I'm going to love to talk about this. Marcion scholars have a problem reconstructing Marcion's text. They don't agree with each other about what it looks like. Back then, I used to be really interested in that stuff. I was like, okay, this could be plausibly older. No, it makes the needle in the haystack look like it's nothing compared to what I'm talking about. It's really hard to deal with it. So you're trying to convince other people that this stuff is good, this stuff is older, when you can't even agree with each other about what the text looks like. Well, we're not off to a good start, are we? That's a problem. Can't even agree with each other. They have drama with each other about what the text looks like. You can't prove it. Don't know. Let me talk about this in Tertullian's against Marcion. He says that Marcion's Philemon looks no different from ours. He actually says that. That's bad. That is really bad for Marcion priority. It's awful for it. I'll tell you why. You know what that means? That Philemon's text is unchanged? And by the way, Tertullian says that Marcion was stopped from modifying it. Who stopped him? I speculate. That's all I can do. He doesn't really explain it. I think it was other Marcionites. They didn't like that he was changing Marcion's text. Oh, sorry. Let me start over. I screwed up. These Marcionites didn't like Marcion modifying Paul's text. So this means that Philemon still had a co-author, Timothy. Philemon's co-written. That small, tiny letter was co-written by Timothy. So that's a problem because that gives you a clue that Marcion actually did abridge the New Testament. He wanted to remove the co-authors. Why? Because he believed that Paul was the only true authority, a true apostle that represented Jesus faithfully. That's what he thought. He said that Paul was the true apostle. So he gets rid of the co-authors: Timothy, Silas, Sosthenes, Tertius. They don't co-write any of the letters. Now, some of them are still there, by the way. Timothy's still there. He's still mentioned. He's just not a co-author anymore. Sosthenes is totally gone because he's only mentioned in 1 Corinthians as a co-author. That's it. He's not mentioned in the body of any of these other texts. So he's gone. Tertius is gone. Silas is also gone. You see my point? 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, they're totally gone. He doesn't even bother abridging them. He just gets rid of them altogether. I got a theory for that. In those letters, the torch is being passed on to Titus and Timothy, the bishop system, the bishopric, the episcopacies. The system's being created in those letters. It doesn't already exist. It's being created. the regulations are being created. I think these letters are massively misinterpreted. It's not presupposing its existence, it's beginning it. Pseudo Paul, Saul of Giscala, who's the man claiming to be Paul. I have to remind people of this, so everybody keeps track of what I'm saying. He is telling people this is coming into existence. First Clement's already laying down the foundation for it. The letters are building the house over it. You get my point. Clement's the foundation. The letters is the house. You get the full picture. You get the complete picture. And so, there you go. And I put it that way. The reason why I put it that way, because Clement does mention the word bishops in plural. So he is already in the process of talking about its beginning. And then it's solidified in the pastorals. Titus and Timothy are getting their final instructions by Saul of Giscala before he's done with it all, before he dies of old age in 97 CE. So that's way too much for Marcel. No, I can't have this. That's way too much authority for Timothy and Titus. Only Paul is true authority. There's not even a successor to Paul. There can't be. He's the only true authority. We must obey his letters. But again, Marcion is ironic. Marcion's using forged letters in Paul's name. He's abridging those forged documents and removes stuff he doesn't like from them. Which is like a forgery on top of another forgery. Double forgery. If I could put it that way. Double whammy. So.
Wow. How are you doing with concluding your thoughts before we take questions? Because
that's it. I said Marcion must be the final thing, just like in my paper. That's it.
Fantastic. All right. Well, if you are done, then we got a slew of questions. Jacob, thank you for that presentation, man. That was. Do you just do you have a library in your brain? Is that how it works? Like you just go in there and pull out the card catalog and just start reading information? Like, holy cow, man.
I'm just the kind of person that can usually do it on the fly.
It's pretty impressive, I'll tell you what. All right, I have a whole bunch of questions here, starting from the beginning. Let's roll through them. How could pop it up here. From True Christian, how could Clement have wanted anything for the church when the church is not a concept that never even existed during the time when the fictional character Clement supposedly lived?
I'm not a Clement mythicist. And by the way, no offense, this would be more radical than anything I've said in this entire show. That there was no church in the whole first century. Nobody believes that. And I know somebody could come back at me and say, just because nobody else believes that doesn't make it true or not true. Like, okay, fair. But my point is, I don't have any reason to think that Clement was made up. I think he was just Titus Flavius Clement, and that's it. If First Clement was a forgery, it would have been after the New Testament was composed, unless you want to claim it was forged before the New Testament. I think there's problems with both views, practically almost equally, at least, if not equally. Why would somebody forge Clement, forget to talk about the parousia, forget to talk about the vision of Paul and all this other stuff? Mike, it's a very empty letter, missing all kinds of detail that should be there if this was a forgery. And how could somebody write Clement for Clement and forget to call him a bishop? I would think if this was a forgery, it would start out, I, Clement, Bishop of Rome, write unto you, people in Corinth. Why doesn't he say something like that? I think people saying that's a forgery would have a better argument. I don't know what's going on. There's a bunch of people out there obsessed and bothering me with this theory. It's a forgery. I'm like, do y'all even read this letter? Like, what is going on here? How do y'all not see the ignorance of the New Testament that I'm clearly seeing? How am I the only one pointing this out? Practically still am the only one pointing this out. It's unbelievable to me. The Clement could not have been more ignorant of the New Testament. It's baffling. I don't have any further response to this. I really
That's all right.
don't.
Move on to the next question. Some of these I'm not sure if you have good answers or whatever, but you can give short or long answers. When were the Paul letters and by who? I'm not...
Well, I've already said multiple times in this whole show. Maybe he's jumping in the middle or wasn't paying attention. I don't know. But okay, well, I'll remind you. Very, very quick answer. Sullivan Guscala co-wrote the letters with Paul. Sullivan Guscala, pretending to be Paul, I meant to say, co-wrote the letters with Timothy, Silas, Asthenes, and Tertius from the years 94 and 97 CE. That's it.
All right. And again, a lot of these questions were asked like over an hour ago, so it's pardon me if you have context with them. So if you don't know where the context was, it's fine. We'll move on. User PB8NV3 and a bunch of other letters and numbers says, so was it Marcion's school behind it all before or after the Gospels?
Not at all. Marcion did not create Paul. He had nothing to do with that. All he did was abridge the text, and that's it. Tore it down, removed stuff he didn't like, removed the co-authors, ignored the pastorals, abridged Ephesians, and renamed it to Laodiceans, and that is it. The Pauline epistles written in 94, 97 CE. I date the Gospels to 100 to 135 CE. I do not think that the Pauline letters were after the Gospels, and I think that Marcion abridged the New Testament after the Gospel of John was written, just a few years later. I think John was written in 135 CE, and I think Marcion, starting in 144, published his text in 144, and he was expelled that year from the Roman Catholic Church. And he suffered a first expulsion in 135. When John, yes, there actually is a text saying this. Yeah, the author of John's Gospel expelled Marcion from the church in Pontus. And then Epiphanius says that the bishop of Pontus was Marcion's dad, making the author of John's Gospel Marcion's father, by the way. Just throwing that out there. But anyway, so when you say before or after the Gospels, Paul's letters is before the Gospels.
Okay. This question isn't necessarily directly related to your content, but figured maybe you might want to give an answer to it. Andrews from 68 says, where does the idea of God come from?
If you mean the idea of the biblical God, that would take me way too long to discuss. It would take us off rails, so I can't answer that today. I would recommend seeing my videos on Ishkur becoming the God of the Bible. And I know that you plan on having me on to talk about that at some point down the line, and we'll get to that at some point. But I don't have the time to talk about that right now. But thank you for the question.
Fair enough. It's a big question. Yeah. Clay Rush 1413. How does one spell Zacchaeus? Jacob said, wrote about James and John being killed by Samaritans.
Z-A, so Zacchaeus. The word search that in the recognitions as well, so you can verify that he does actually quote the lost epistle by the man Zacchaeus, who wrote about the material about John, James, and James, the brother of Jesus, being attacked in book 1 of the recognitions.
All right. And then let's see. Barnes Web 52 asked, so was Paul a dwarf? And I think they followed up later with that's full size can be lowered in a basket or something like that. So that was the context of this question.
Well, I didn't address that here. I usually do. So this is a good opportunity.
Sometimes people ask questions to each other, and I'm just throwing.
Oh yeah. This is a good opportunity for me to bring this up. So no, I don't believe Paul was a dwarf. Okay. I've seen some people believe that, but not many. It's not my knowledge. 2 Corinthians 11:32-33 talks about Paul's flight from Damascus, and it claims that King Aretas IV and Nabatea controlled Damascus. Well, that's a problem because Josephus mentions that King Aretas III controlled Damascus 100 years before Paul's day. Well, that's a problem. In my paper, I point out that Abraham Negev, who's done a lot of extensive work on the Nabatean kingdom, says that there is no archaeological evidence to support the claim, I'm paraphrasing, but to support the idea that King Aretas IV controlled Damascus. So a Nabatean ruler of Damascus cannot be explained. And I agree. There's no evidence. There's no reason to believe it unless you believe 2 Corinthians. There's no reason to believe that. 2 Corinthians gets it wrong really badly. Like the Gospel of Mark screwing up on Herod Antipas being a king when he was actually a tetrarch. The later Gospels correct this error, but in Second Corinthians, in my view, is making an even bigger mistake than the Gospel of Mark did. Mark got the title wrong. Second Corinthians puts Aretas in the wrong century. I think what happened, to explain real fast, is that Second Corinthians was using Josephus. Saulus, that guy that was killed by Nero in 66, he fled from Herodium in 66. He fled from there, and he fled from there, and then it mentions Damascus just after that. Just after that. So what that tells me is that Luke and Acts is correcting the mistake by saying that Paul fled from Jews. He never mentions King Aretas. Now, Luke has a theological agenda. I know that he wants to blame Jews, but it's more than just that. He wants to correct a mistake in 2 Corinthians. That's what he does, while also making his own mistakes in the way he uses Josephus.
All right. Next question from Barnesweb 52. Jerome claimed the original gospel was in a library of his own lifetime, 380. Did he ever make any such claim for any letter from Paul? The original was kept safe?
Not that I recall.
Okay. From Deconverted Man. Is there evidence that Paul actually persecuted Christians other than the writings of the Bible saying that?
Well, I already gave evidence that Paul persecuted not Christians but Nazarenes. It's important to get the term right for his time. But my point is, he never converted. He never believed in Jesus, never accepted Jesus. He only wrote concerning what the Nazarenes believed. Excuse me. He wrote reports. That's all he did. He didn't actually believe any of this stuff. He was changed into becoming the apostle in the 90s. The changes are, in a way, I already think Clement of Rome was already kind of making those changes himself to a degree, and then the epistles carried out all the way.
All right, another one from Deconverted Man. What does the dating on the relevant scrolls, pages, fragments of the Bible say about when it was written?
Which parts of the Bible? Because I don't got time to talk about the whole thing. I mean, to give a fast answer, I think the Old Testament was written by a committee in the 3rd century BCE that worked on created the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint simultaneously. I think they wrote all books except Daniel. I think Daniel's written in the 2nd century BCE. I got a paper in the works on that. And I think that the epistles written in 94, 97 CE, and I think the 4 Gospels were written in 2nd century. So that's like a fast pace conclusion of what I say, and skipped a lot of details that I've got time.
Well, thanks for keeping it brief because we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, I actually got to leave. So let's. I think we gotta close. Yeah.
Last question from Deconverted Man. Are you related to Nick Cage?
You know, I get this a lot that people say that I look like Nicolas Cage. I
could totally see that. It's so funny.
It took me a moment to really think about that. I'm like, why do you think that? Like, well, I guess a little bit. Well, maybe. I don't know.
James Valiant 6707. Nero just killed Christians per Tacitus, but can't you imagine some releases in 64?
I think Tacitus made a mistake. It was Nazarenes, not Christians. I think Tacitus was being anachronistic about that.
All right.
But other than that, yes, I believe what he said about what Nero was doing there was true. But I don't. Okay, the combination of Epaphroditus and a Clement and the whole imprisonment and the release all at the same time only happens in the 90s. I'll put it that way. That's it.
All right. Idaho Yeti. So if Paul, a murderer, received revelation and saw a vision of Jesus, how can you deny Joseph Smith also had a vision of God and received revelation.
Did I ever claim that he actually had the vision? I said the vision was made up and was put into Paul's text when he never said it.
Correct.
Never claimed to have even gotten a vision. And even if he did, why should we believe him? Even if that were true, that he actually made that claim, why should we believe him?
Correct. Totally
Like
agree.
he didn't even make the claim anyway. It was just a lie. And Joseph Smith, I mean, come on, the dude is a con man. I mean,
Yeah, for real.
oh, and then don't need to get me started into contradictory statements by the people that supposedly saw the gold plates. That alone destroys an entire religion of Mormonism, as far as
I'm going to
concerned.
move us on to the next question, just because I know we're running out of time. And you got to go.
That was too easy.
1984. Didn't the Sumerians invent writing, or am I making that up? They certainly have the oldest written story with Gilgamesh.
The Sumerians are the oldest writings that we currently know of. I think that's the safest way of putting it, because there could be stuff out there we don't know yet.
Gotcha. Very good.
There's a lot of unknowns.
M4D with a bunch of letters and numbers again. What evidence do we have showing that the sum of the letters of Paul are forgeries, while other letters are not forgeries?
We don't. We have no. That's my point. We have no way of determining that the way that the system is set up. It's circular. It's like, oh, well, 6 of them are forgeries, 7 of them are not. Well, even if the way they delineated it was correct, how do you know that 7 had to be by Paul? All that it would prove to you, which it doesn't prove, is that those 7 were written by one person coherently. But when they say that something is non-Pauline and something is Pauline, shouldn't we say that it's non-Timothine and non-Silene too? We keep forgetting these are co-written texts. And these texts are filled with contradictions. I need to talk about that for a second here. I'll give you a couple of very fast examples. Should women lead in church or should they not and be silent? Romans versus 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy says women should be silent. 1 Corinthians says women should be silent. Romans says no. They can lead. Now, 1 Corinthians is co-authored. Romans is co-authored. 1 Timothy is not co-authored. So when I look at that, I was like, okay, well, whose view is whose? Like, who believes what? How do I delineate that? Well, if you look at 1 Corinthians about that text saying that women should be quiet in the church, well, what you have going on is that view is from Saul of Giscala, pseudo Paul, biblical, the man pretending to be Paul in the letters, just repeating all those details real quick. So when you look at 1 Timothy, pseudo Paul is telling you that he actually does believe women should be quiet in the church. But Romans, which was co-written by Tertius or Tertius, however you want to pronounce that, Romans 16, he introduces himself as co-author Romans 16, which is different from. He disagrees. He thinks no, they can lead. Let's talk about the celestial pre-existing Christ. In Philippians, Jesus takes the form of a man. He pre-existed. In Colossians, he was a prototokos. He was there from the beginning, the firstborn of God's creation. And yet, in Galatians and in 2 Timothy, Jesus is conceived. He's created at his conception. And he's created on earth. He's not pre-existent. Well, Colossians and Philippians are co-written by Timothy. So when I look at the single author letters, you following me? You look at the single author letters that's written by Saul of Giscala, who's claiming to be Paul alone by himself. He's telling you what he thinks, apart from what the co-authors think. That's how you set up the dichotomy properly. Then you look at Colossians and Philippians and see that they both talk about the celestial Jesus when the other letters don't. Because that was Timothy's view. So there are just 2 examples how the co-authors actually explain a lot in these letters. These are not co-authors that write in the traditional way of co-authorship. They're not agreeing on every detail. And that explains a few things. That's why in Romans, it's cool to lie for the glory of God. It actually says that. and it's okay to have different views in Christ, as long as we're all in Christ, 1 Corinthians. So the letters are already laying down the formula for co-authors writing contradictory stuff together. It's already giving excuses for it.
All right. From M, letters and numbers. Did the authors not write the date at the top of the manuscript they wrote? Are we judging how old the documents are based on the age of the material used to write on?
Yeah, that is a problem. We're usually not. There is one exception that actually exists. There's a manuscript. I can't remember the name of it. There's a manuscript that actually dates itself. A biblical manuscript. I think it was like 894, 870 something, 8 CE. I can't remember the exact year. But there, you can look it up. I'm gonna look it up right now because I'm actually curious. Which biblical manuscript gives a date of itself on the text? I could have sworn I heard about it. No, I can't find it that fast on the fly. But I'm sure somebody here can figure it out. But anyway, thanks for the question.
Yep.
Let's get to the super chat. I gotta get going after that. I gotta leave.
Well, we got literally 7 more questions, including the super chat. So you agree with keep the answer short. So you agree with the thesis, Jacob? All the epistles are pious forgeries.
Yes.
Okay. Who remade Paul in the 90s?
Solid Griscala and his co-author Timothy Sosthenes and Tertius.
freaking library in that head, I swear to God. Barnes Web 52. When did it become consensus to say Mark was first?
I would say probably 19th century. It was already kind of getting pushed around before that, but it started hitting hard in the 19th century.
All right.
Especially by the early 20th.
James Valiant 6707. Jacob, what portion of canonical Paul goes back to the OG Paul of the 30s?
The stuff that First Clement describes in that one letter that he quotes or describes, he doesn't even really quote, he describes, and the creedal statement, 1 Corinthians 15, regarding the visions of Paul, Cephas. Sorry, not Paul. Not the vision of Paul. I misspoke there. The visions of Cephas, the 500, and James, and the bit about Jesus being the first, being the last Adam, in distinction from the first Adam from the Genesis.
You were turning those pages just a little too quick in your brain. Slow down, man. All right, from Barnes Web 52. Have you read the Aramaic Matthew of Andrew Roth?
No, I don't think I have. I'll look into that. I've done a lot of work into Hebrew Matthew, and I think I am familiar with Andrew Roth. His name has come up before.
All right.
Anyway, that's all I can say.
Simply thanks, Jacob.
Thank you.
And yes, I agree with that.
Thank you for
so
that.
much, Jacob. And for the rest of you, sorry we can't get to any more of your questions. I grabbed all the ones that we had up until the point we started doing questions. So I apologize if you were still chatting because I saw a whole bunch of stuff come through, but we're just going to have to move on without it. But Jacob, you are awesome. Thank you so much. Just a couple of things real quick coming up this Sunday. If you are a non-Christian, or a Christian rather, and you have questions and you want to challenge an atheist, call in to Skeptic Haven's Let's Talk. Does God Get Angry? That's this Sunday, 5 p.m. I am in conjunction with Skeptic Atheism. With Skeptic Haven. So we hope that you'll join that. And then on Tuesday on Skeptic Haven, as well as our channel, The Deconversionists, Christianity Causes an Identity Crisis. That's what we'll be talking about. So you can hop in the room and chat live with us. We would love to interact with you if you are a theist, but also non-theists or atheists can join in as well. And make sure you subscribe to my channel, The Unraveler, which is where I'm broadcasting from right now, even though most of you are joining in from History Valley. But please go over to The Unraveler AB for Alan Bonder, The Unraveler AB. And the links are in the info. Please subscribe to me. That helps me out tremendously. Make sure you click some likes on both of our channels. That makes a huge difference. It tells YouTube where to broadcast and helps them know what kind of content people are looking for and think is important. So please support us. And my current series that I'm doing on The Unraveler is Unravelation, How Those of Faith Find Freedom. They release every Monday and Thursday. So make sure you subscribe and make sure you get notified of these things so you don't miss them. It's a real fun series, and I've heard it's helped a lot of people. And lastly, join us on Deconversion Nation on Facebook. It's a great place for you to interact with theists and atheists alike, be able to ask questions and have dialogue. So go on over there and join us there. And with that said, Jacob, that is the end. Do you have any closing thoughts you would like to say?
No, that's it. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My friends, it is so good to see you again, and I look forward to the next time. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.